Well, there are two things, I think, and they're very different in the kind of answers that I would give. One is the Principles of Biomedical Ethics, which I wrote with Jim Childers, and was writing at exactly the time I was writing Belmont. So I would be drafting Belmont during the day, and then I would either go home or go to the office and meet Jim at night and write part of the Principles of Biomedical Ethics. Somehow people have thought, a number of commentators have thought the one was written before the other or something, but they are actually written directly simultaneously. And as you can imagine, I was learning from the one context to the other. A simple example of that is Childers and I had been operating largely on a clinical ethics model, because that's where most of the issues were that were discussed at the time. So I'm seeing all this stuff in the National Commission, and I'm saying, whoa, research ethics is at least as important as clinical ethics, and so we began to incorporate a lot of what I was learning there back into the drafting of the Principles of Biomedical Ethics. But the real story, I think, about Principles of Biomedical Ethics is that it has taken me and Jim 7 editions to sort of get the landscape mapped out in the way in which we really think it should be mapped out. And I don't know that we've really still gotten it exactly the way it should be. In that, in part, is because of all of the changes and the maturation, I think, really that's occurred in bioethics more generally. So we had to keep up what was going on in the field and revise our book in that light. And in, say, maybe the second edition, that wasn't so difficult because the material was still very sparse. There wasn't that much material. We're doing the second edition before the presidential commission from 1980 to 1983 has completed its work and has its volumes out. So it wasn't that difficult in the early years, but then in the later years, this enormous amount of work is done in bioethics that we have to accommodate, but that's to our advantage. It's just a huge amount of work to actually make a revision. Sometimes people think when you do a revised edition of work, you slap a few sentences here and there and you add a section to a chapter maybe, and that's it. That's really not what happened. We had to continue, the book continued to evolve as the field would continue to evolve. And someone like John Ayres would accuse us, this was in good humor, but John would say, you're the great Borg. You're assimilating all this knowledge and then incorporating it within your system. And I've said to John, to a certain extent, that was true. We were learning what everybody else was doing. But in any event, that of course has been a huge project, a 35-year project, really, for me and Jim. The other was the book that Ruth and I did on a history and theory of informed consent, but it was actually done with 2 other people, one of whom is acknowledged on the title page, and that's Nancy King. But the other was Bettina Schoene-Seifert, a German physician of some notoriety in European bioethics, but I think probably no longer, anyway, a major player on the American scene. But Bettina was in there very early, and she's very, very smart. And so what happened was Ruth and I hired the 2 of them as research assistants, not knowing how good they were. Actually, I think we were probably originally just envisaged them as research assistants. So Bettina's a physician. I'm a philosopher. Nancy's a lawyer. And Ruth comes from public health and health psychology. So we got major disciplinary differences. And why this was so important to me is I learned from the year and a half or so when all 4 of us sat around a conference table, and sometimes it was our dining room in our house, and debated these issues about informed consent. I don't know if you know what the literature was like at the time, but there were just a few what I would call first-rate contributors, one of whom was, of course, Jay Katz. And we debate their ideas and all of the stuff that had happened in law. And we came to realize all the deficiencies of law because these are really moral issues, not really constrained in the way in which the legal thinking was constrained. The bottom line point I want to make is I think like most philosophers, let's just say many philosophers, were pretty naive about what real multidisciplinary research was like, where you really had to accommodate the thought of people in other fields. Now, it had a certain significant exposure to that with the National Commission as part of it, no question, because we had multiple disciplines and we had to work through things in this way. But I think this was the first time I really came to see how multidisciplinary research should operate in a very creative way in which you pay no attention to disciplines. You just take the issues and then you begin to attack them from your perspectives and work through them. That was hugely important to me in my own development because I never left the multidisciplinary thing behind after that. It was even hard for me to think through ethical issues just as a philosopher, which is I think what most philosophers do. They're trained as philosophers. They think through it in that way. I think through ethical issues in terms of what are people from law and people from the sciences and so on going to think around this. So it was a sort of life-transforming experience. But again, I would have to say it was both the National Commission and the writing of the History and Theory of Informed Consent.